Good evening, everyone. I'm still waiting for a few more participants and we'll begin pretty shortly. Thanks for joining us. Just give us a few more minutes and we can begin this public outreach session. Thank you. Great, we have around 16 participants and 8 panelists. This meeting is being recorded and Casey, could you see if Bob Creech, yes, if you can promote him as a panelist.
He should be promoted now.
Great. So I believe today we'll be joined by planning board members and Bob would be helping us call this meeting to order. Bob, thank you.
So, good evening, everybody. My name is Bob Creech, Chair of the Lexington Planning Board. And since we are expecting more than 2 members to join us this evening, we are calling to order a meeting of the Lexington Planning Board. So joining me this evening are Planning Board members Charles Hornig, Jenna Johnson, and Richard Canali. So there are 4 Planning Board members present this evening. Okay, thank you, Ms. Heyer.
Thank you, Mr. Creech. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. This is the third public outreach session in our Hartwell Rezoning Initiative. We conducted two public outreaches during October 15th. We had the coffee hour session when we discussed the timeline and the process. We also had a session on October 29th, which was about constraints and conservation and navigation easement. Today, our meeting is about design guidelines. To start the meeting, I would request Casey to start with the ground rules.
Sure. So, whoops, feedback here. Hold on one second.
While Casey's doing that, I wonder if Mr. Creech could read the script that the AG's office requires of chairs, please.
I'd be glad to do it. I thought that we didn't need to do that since we're not, but I will do that. So I'm going to ask the board, well, we know that Mr. Hornig, Mr. Canali, Ms. Johnson, and Mr. Creech are here. Consistent with Governor Baker's executive order of March 12, 2020, suspending specific provisions of Mass General Law 38, Section 18, due to the current state of emergency in the Commonwealth due to the outbreak of COVID-19. This meeting of the Lexington Planning Board is being conducted remotely. In-person attendance is not permitted at this time. Every effort will be made to ensure that the public can adequately access proceedings in real time via technological means. In the event that access cannot be provided, an audio or video recording of this meeting will be available on the town for review on the Town of Lexington website, which has already been published by the moderator of the meeting. For this meeting, the Lexington Planning Board is meeting by video conference via Zoom. Specific information for remote participation by the public can be found. I'm not sure it can be found on the planning office's webpage, but it is available on the Hartwell Ave webpage. If at any time in the meeting you have a question, please use the Q&A feature, which has already been mentioned. Please note that this meeting is being recorded and that some attendees are participating by video conference. Accordingly, please be aware that other folks may be able to see you and that you should take care not to share screen your computer. Anything that you broadcast may be recorded. Thank you.
Great, so I can review some of the ground rules. We are starting this meeting as a webinar, so if you are a participant, you will not be present on video at this point of the meeting, but we do ask that you remain on mute, and if you have any questions, please direct them to the chat. The question and answer box is not available in this webinar. I apologize for that there, but please direct any questions to the chat. Once we conclude the presentations, we will open the meeting up as a meeting. And so you will be able to participate via video and raise your hand and speak if you have questions, or you can direct the questions directly to the chat once again. We will have someone moderating the chat. And as Mr. Creech mentioned, this meeting is being recorded, and we're also using live transcript, if you can see that at the bottom of the screen, for those who need that feature. And after the conclusion of the meeting, in about a day, the video will be available on the town website. So with that, I will turn it over to Sandhya.
I apologize. Too many screens. Toggling the mouse can be can take a couple of minutes. Thank you, Casey. Thank you, Mr. Creed, for joining us, and planning board members for joining this session with us today. So today's agenda, we will be going through a recap of what we discussed last time. We will have some highlights from the conservation feedback that we received last week. In addition to that, it's an exciting day today because we'll be releasing our new website, which is HIP, Hartwell Innovation. Hartwell Innovation, I am forgetting my park. Yes, Hartwell Innovation Park, Lexington.com, HIP Lexington.com, and we'll be sharing the website today with you. And today's session is about design guidelines, and Carol Kowalski, who's the Assistant Town Manager for Development, will be going through some of the highlights of what is design guidelines and why do we need that for rezoning and zoning bylaws. Ted Browitz, he is our consultant who's been working with us for the past couple of years to bring this zoning bylaw articles to the town. So he will be presenting some of the ideas of design guidelines and overview, and then we'll be having the feedback session. Casey, next slide, please. So most of you are familiar with our team here. Carol is our Assistant Town Manager for Development. You can reach out to us anytime if you have any questions or feedback, and this particular slide deck will be available on the new website as well as the town website. So you have our email addresses if you have questions or concerns. Amanda Loomis, Planning Director, Sheila Page, Assistant Planning Director, Casey Haggerty, who's the Economic Development Coordinator, and Stella Carr, Sustainability Director, and I'm Sandhya Iyer, I'm the Economic Development Director for the town. Thank you. Next slide, please. Great. Amanda, if you can address this slide.
Yep. So as we've presented previously, we have several project objectives that we need to be mindful of this entire time. This project has been moving forward with all of the public outreach sessions, but the one thing that we need to be mindful of is all of our stakeholders. That includes landowners and developers that want a clear, predictable, efficient process. They also want to see increased development opportunities throughout if they're going to make an investment, and also have the ability to attract new businesses or retain businesses so they can grow in place. The residential neighborhoods that surround the Hartwell Bedford Street area want to make sure that the traffic and safety is addressed, but they also want to make sure that the permitting process is transparent, where they can actually have a meaningful engagement and make an impact on the project. The Lexington community as a whole, we want to promote reasonable economic development to ensure that we can grow our tax base, but also make sure that we attract uses that are desirable for the community within this area. Staff and the permitting authority want to make sure that we receive all of the necessary information, documentation, plans, etc., at the start, because that is actually how we can make sure that the permitting process goes through efficiently, but also make sure everything is reviewed properly. Next slide. So this is the Hartwell area that we're looking at. So the yellow boundary is the proposed zoning district, which would be known as the Hartwell Innovation Park, or the HIP. The purple is currently manufacturing. The orangish color is CRO. And then we have a couple planned development districts. Also in the upper right-hand corner, that's 475 Bedford Street. That is single family zoning. So the use is not compatible. It's a pre-existing non-conforming. Next slide.
Thank you, Amanda. So the initiative will be presented in phases. So right now we are going through the fall town meeting, the special town meeting. As most of you are attending some of these town meetings, I think we have Mr. Charles Honing with us today, who will be presenting the citizens article 16, 17, and 18, which are related to the Hartwell rezoning effort, and his articles I believe are coming to the town meeting on Thursday, which is the 12th. The staff is conducting communication outreach, public outreach currently, and this will be through the winter, and December 1st, we plan on releasing a draft zoning bylaw. And December 14th, we plan on releasing the draft design guidelines, and both should be available on our new website, which Casey, if you can share it or I can share it.
Yep, I can pull it up. Just one second.
Sure, absolutely. So staff has put together this website wherein you can review all the materials, all the videos that we've had so far, the public outreach videos. We also have some of the content from the vision slides, and we will be having most of our content, like design guidelines and zoning bylaw, in this new website. Our maps are also in there with all the different layers. Yeah, if you could scroll down. So here's some of the video content that you can see, some of the project information. There are some quick links so that you can watch or look at the presentations that we've been having, and press release, news, anything related to Lexington and commercial rezoning is available there. We have the FAQ page, which currently has questions related to project, but we'll be adding more Q&A or FAQs, which are frequently asked questions regarding conservation, design guidelines. And if you have any questions, there is a communication page wherein you can enter those questions, and that should be directed to the staff, and we can respond through that if you have questions, or if you have concerns about or any comments about the rezoning initiative. So So please do look at the website, and if you have anything to add, please let us know. It's again www.hiplexington.com. Thank you. Casey, can we go back to the slides? And just to reiterate, you should be able to see the draft zoning bylaw on the website on December 1st, 2020, and the draft design guidelines by December 14th, 2020 for review purposes. Next slide, please. Great. So Amanda, if you can go back to the feedback from October 29th. Thank you.
So on October 29th, we really focused on the constraints associated with Hartwell. Those constraints include stormwater, wetlands, floodplains, and the aviation. But there's also infrastructure easements that also can impede development. So what we heard and what we can take away from that session on October 29th from our conservation director, the two experts from Woodward and Curran, and then also the public conversation that has taken place and also people who provided comments. So we need to make sure that we can mitigate the impacts of development. That happens both during construction and post-construction because there are a lot of sensitive areas within the Hartwell area. We also need to protect those natural resources and waterways. And when we're doing that, we need to make sure that one, thermal pollution is mitigated, but also we want to make sure that we can reduce the impervious surfaces that can actually cause a detriment to those ecosystems. We also want to make sure that we are utilizing best management practices, also known as BMPs, and also utilize low impact development, LIDs. And then we need to make sure that we can manage stormwater and the erosion that is associated with it because the storms do keep becoming more intense. So that is going to be the goals that we have taken away from the stormwater, wetlands, floodplains, aviation constraints session, and making sure that those are addressed within the zoning bylaw, and then also the design guidelines. If we could have the next slide, please. So this is Hartwell. The yellow boundary is the boundary of the Hartwell Innovation Park. The gray boxes are the existing structures. And then the hatched out area is actually impervious surfaces associated with those structures. So most of it is parking lots. In Hartwell, there's actually 51 parcels that we're looking at. That number is going to be key to remember on the next slide. There's about 200,000 square feet of development that already exists, but there's about 400 acres of opportunity within the Hartwell district. Next slide, please. So this looks like a weather map of a big storm coming through. What this shows is actually all those constraints that we talked about at the October 29th session. So that bright green is the aviation. So we have to make sure that the heights of those buildings do not exceed the allowed easement. But then we have the wetlands, but we have the floodplains. With the wetlands, there's a 25-foot buffer, which is that red boundary around the lighter blue area. The blue streaks that go through and they kind of run into zigzags, those are all streams or rivers. Those also have an associated buffer with them as well. And then we also have the utility easements. So we have stormwater, but we also have the water and sewer. And then there's a massive high tension wire that actually runs through the middle of Hartwell along, and you can kind of see it when it comes out at Bedford Street and crosses the road and cuts across where 475 Bedford Street, where the Boston Sports Club is. So when you're actually looking at this, the amount of development is actually very limited, but if you do it smartly, you can actually get a very good project. So there are only 9 parcels out of 51 parcels that have no constraints at all, which means that there's no easements, wetlands, streams, or aviation. There's only 4 parcels that have one constraint. There's 8 parcels that have 2, but basically more than half, or 30 out of 51, have 3 or more constraints. So as you can see in the center area of this map, a lot of those parcels have a constraint of a stream, wetlands, a floodplain, Also the aviation, they also have the easements running through them, which creates challenges for development. So these are things that we need to be mindful of. So next slide, please. So these big takeaways that we're going to be taking away with us to make sure that they're put into the bylaw and also the design guidelines are regarding stormwater. They're also going to be touching on landscaping, because we heard the preservation of mature trees, very difficult to regrow a 30-year tree. So we want to make sure that those are preserved, very easy to clear cut. But then when you clear cut, you also have flooding increases, erosion issues, and also other site topography problems. Site lighting is another thing that we heard, so we need to make sure that that's addressed within the bylaw. The watershed, we're in the watershed. We also have a lot of constraints, but we could put together fee in lieu or mitigation, but we also want to make sure we are addressing climate resiliency throughout this. We're having a session on December 7th that touches on sustainability, so we're going to get more into that later. The infrastructure, we have to make sure that the infrastructure both on public property and private property is adequate and also meets the needs of both the development and the town. The requirements, these are requirements that the Conservation Commission and also the Planning Board are going to need. We want to make sure that we have the floodplain calculations, how much water is on the site, the groundwater, etc. We want to make sure that we have management statements. How is this development or the developer going to mitigate or manage these different constraints on their project or within their project, both during construction and long term? The construction, we want to make sure we protect everything as we previously said. And then the other thing is impervious surfaces. So with development, you always increase impervious surfaces, but there's things that we can do to mitigate that, such as blue roofs, green roofs, pervious pavement where applicable, but also shared parking where you can reduce, or encouraging people to go to structured parking. So these are all things that were discussed on the October 29th meeting that we are going to be bringing forward with us as we continue to draft the bylaw and things evolve through the public process.
Thank you, Amanda. Karen,
So
if you can, give us, yeah, thank you.
Sure. Thank you. Thanks, Amanda. Thanks, Sandhya. I'm very happy to have all of you here tonight. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm just going to go over a few basics about design guidelines. Design guidelines work, next slide, please. Design guidelines work in coordination with zoning. They're usually a separate document, but there's interplay between the design guidelines and the zoning. The design guidelines are usually a separate document so that you can amend them, adjust them as you learn things about the development where it's not as easy as everyone knows to update zoning. So almost always I've seen design guidelines separate from the zoning document. Design guidelines also remove anxiety and uncertainty by providing clear expectations to residents, property owners, architects, civil engineers, and boards. Design guidelines also provide appropriate and acceptable solutions to site context and to the goals for the district. So that appropriate and acceptable solutions phrase is really helpful to focus on a little bit because it's telling people ahead of time what will be good conditions for them to adopt in each area of the development. Slide 2, please. Or next slide. Design guidelines usually talk about the relationship of the buildings, parking, streets, and other ways to get around. They talk about the scale of the development, building access points, and public improvements. It's always best when they are based on the vision that's illustrated in a plan like the Hartwell vision that the elected boards here have embraced. The design guidelines can contrast with the existing conditions, if there's something about the existing conditions that you know you don't want, and they should help achieve the design objectives that you do want. Next slide, please. I mentioned that there's an interplay of zoning and design guidelines. A couple points to remember about that interplay is you should not require something in the design guidelines that happens to be prohibited in the zoning. You'd be surprised, but this does happen. So we want to guard against that. There's got to be consistency between the two documents. We also want to make sure that you should not have requirements that make it difficult to meet the zoning requirements. You don't want something in the design guidelines that'll make it difficult to meet zoning. For example, conflicts between parking requirements in the two. Next slide, please. We humans experience development usually at the street level, in the public realm. So design guidelines should use metrics about building setbacks, parking locations, building scale, the places where we experience the district, where we experience the building, not necessarily metrics that are theoretical that we don't really experience, like floor area ratios, FARs. Design guidelines should also use photos, graphics, drawings, and diagrams, because as we all know, a picture is worth 1,000 words. Next slide, please. And design guidelines should clearly address the end users. The people who will use these are the site planner, the architect, designer, the landscape architect. And we also want to identify in the design guidelines those who will be responsible for administering the guidelines. We also want to identify a clear process to free those responsible from having to make arbitrary decisions and forcing them to make subjective interpretations, whether it's board members, staff members, applicants, whoever's responsible, who has a role in the design guidelines. We want to make it clear for them. So that's a quick little 101 on what good design guidelines will include and characteristics they should have. Thank you. So now we're going to hear from Ted Brovitz, who has been working with us on this project for some time. Ted is also working on another project for the town. So Ted is going to go into a little more detail for us. And this is where we're really going to hear more about what we may end up seeing or could potentially end up seeing in the design guidelines for Hartwell. Go ahead, Ted.
Thanks, Carol. And thanks, Amanda, for those great overviews of the zoning and environmental constraints and design guidelines. As we discussed, I mean, clearly there's a lot of constraints in Hartwell, both from an environmental standpoint with all of the wetlands and floodplains, as well as the navigation easements and the utility easements. And to make that even more complicated, there is zoning requirements currently that really facilitate a particular, like an old sort of 1970s, 1980s suburban business park. Large lot zoning, 3 acres of land is a minimum lot size, a lot of frontage, 200 feet, and a floor area ratio of 0.35. And those people that don't know what a floor area ratio is, basically it's the relationship between the size of the building and the size of the lot. So if you've got a 10,000 square foot lot, a 0.35 floor area ratio would be a 3,500 square foot building. So it's a pretty small amount of space that can be used for buildings. And that's particularly difficult for a place like Hartwell, which is really driving our local economic opportunity, and the floor area ratio really doesn't match the opportunity that's out there. And what we're trying to do is progress from a sort of a 1970s, 1980s business park to a more contemporary life science park where there's greater development opportunities on these lots, which are pretty well constrained. So we are, next slide. So, we've been working on the vision of Hartwell for the last couple of years and probably beyond, before that as well. But essentially what we're trying to do is make the most of those properties out there that aren't fully constrained. And again, they've been developed over the last number of years in a pattern that is pretty inefficient. And again, we're trying to progress this into a more contemporary business park and to facilitate better opportunities and economic development. So in going through the visioning process, a lot of things were identified as potential keys to the future. The first thing is creating an intermodal network, a series of streetscapes and street design, complete street design, that will sort of set the tone for reinvestment in these adjacent properties. So if you look at the top image on the right, that's the current cross-section of Hartwell Avenue, stretching back to the faces of the opposing buildings. So basically it's a 100-foot right-of-way, and the typical lot setback is 75 feet. So the vision below is sort of the idea that this will become a multimodal corridor with accommodations for bikes and pedestrians and buses, as well as, a very nice streetscape treatment to sort of set the stage for reinvestment in the future. Next slide. Also looking at that 75-foot setback, we're looking at that opportunity for new development, reinvestment in the properties, whereas again, the pattern is more of an 80s pattern. The contemporary business park is really bringing the buildings up to the street, up to between these buildings and the streetscape. And that's really a key opportunity in Hartwell. Again, because most of those frontage areas don't have significant constraints, environmental constraints or navigation constraints. Next slide. So again, putting together the streetscape improvements and creating a nice series of opportunities for people on bike or in car or on foot, and then bringing up those buildings close to the street now and the sidewalks, and that interaction, so that sort of lively space that gets created on the other side of the right-of-way between pocket parks and outdoor seating and plazas and that sort of thing, that really create a vibrant business center that can really draw a lot of investment and opportunities in terms of employment and business development. So that's really what one of our main objectives is, part of putting together these design guidelines and new zoning. Next slide. The other opportunity that's been identified is the surface parking lots on the sides and to the rear of the buildings. Some of it is pretty well underutilized, and Lexington has a pretty high ratio of parking requirements to square footage. So there may be real opportunities here to invest and redevelop portions of these properties, of these surface lots, as well as create internal connections so that adjacent property owners have the opportunity to share parking resources if that's a possibility, as well as creating more opportunities for structured parking so we can stay in a smaller footprint and save other areas in those surface lots for new development. Next slide. And then finally, the big opportunity is creating more of a relationship with surrounding conservation lands and open spaces, both public and private open outdoor amenity spaces that would be on site at these given developments, these given properties. So, the idea of, using the Minuteman Trail as sort of a spine, and then offshoots of that would create smaller trails and pathways. And then again, sort of the spine of the new Hartwell streetscapes, connecting to the individual properties and creating a better network of open space systems. Next slide. So basically the challenge for all of us is to take these visions, sort of the sort of the themes and opportunities that have been identified through the visioning process, sort of a conceptual plan, both for development as well as the streetscapes in the middle, and then translating that into a series of zoning, context-based zoning requirements, as well as design guidelines that are compatible with those zoning standards. Next slide. So basically on your left, you've got your typical zoning regulations, permitted uses, dimensional standards, landscaping and screening, lighting and noise control, traffic, parking and loading, and signs. So basically, that gives you the basic parameters of development on a given site. And Amanda's working, a lot on that. I'm working on design guidelines, and we need to coordinate our efforts to make sure that we are creating a system of standards that are compatible and consistent with the design guidelines. And on your right, you see how, for example, the image of that block there, that building with no fascia on it, that is really sort of what you get from floor area ratio and the dimensional standards. You get basically an envelope of development. So the design guidelines are really all about shaping that envelope that's created by zoning. So you're looking at, site improvements, building design characteristics, how to integrate, quality open spaces, and then the relationships with the public realm, the streets and the streetscapes. Next slide. So I'm sort of blocked here for. So this is a diagram that shows you what the procedure that would probably be used in carrying out the design guidelines. So an applicant would come in. We encourage each applicant to have a meeting with staff, with planning staff, before they proceed to a full site plan application. Once that site plan application is filed with the planning board, the development review team would take a thorough look at it and compare it to the design guidelines. And the development review team is basically staff from the planning office, economic development, building, engineering, whoever's needed given the particular type of site plan that's submitted. There'd be staff involved in helping them shape and refine the site plan so that it's consistent with the design guidelines as much as possible. That then would go back to the planning board with recommendations from the development review team, and then on to site plan review, where it would be approved with conditions or be denied or just simply approved with no conditions. So that's the basic process and the relationship of the design guidelines to the site plan review process. Next slide. Oh. Next one. So basically, we're writing the guidelines right now, and it'll probably be another few weeks before we have our first full draft. And so we're trying to define the principles, and really what we're after has been sort of mentioned before: sustainable growth and development, compact development, human scale design, a mix of commercial industrial uses with flexible building spaces, so that we can we can go with the market as things change, go up and down in terms of favorable uses and market opportunities. Architectural context and the ability to adapt, have adaptive reuse of existing buildings. Active open space and civic spaces, quality landscape and streetscape characters, multi-mobility, and fulfill economic development. So really, in order to achieve all these principles, or to address all these principles, it's really important that we make a strong relationship between private investment and private development and the public realm, those areas along the streets and the streetscapes. Next slide. So in terms of site improvements, basically, as we've talked, having, integrated stormwater best practices, having flexible parking standards, again, providing opportunities for structured parking, whether it's below ground or above ground, as well as, placement of parking. We don't want, surface parking in front of the buildings. It goes on the side or to the rear. Also concerned about access, vehicle access. We want to reduce the number of curb cuts as much as possible. Try to encourage shared curb cuts as much as possible, as well as having safe pedestrian connections between the public sidewalk and the buildings and the parking lots. These are all aspects of site development that would be addressed in the design guideline. Additional things that might be considered as well as sort of encouraging clustering of buildings, so that we avoid any of the environmental constraints that are predominant in the district, as well as building placement and orientation. It's really important that, again, as we're going to create a contemporary business park, that the buildings are oriented towards the street and have a strong relationship with the streetscape. Next slide. So building design, basically we want to make sure that there's good transparency, particularly at street level where there might be other commercial uses, complementary uses such as restaurants and so on. We want to make sure that anything that's along the sidewalk, any buildings that are close to the sidewalk have, interesting views inside the ground floor area. We want to make sure that there's good modulation or articulation of buildings, particularly the longer they are or the taller they are. We want to make sure that there's a character and architectural features built into the design. The rooftops, we want to make sure that any kind of rooftop equipment is concealed or buffered from view on the sidewalk or on the street. And another, several other sort of building design things in terms of sustainability, trying to use, trying to integrate, best practices for, utilize latent energy and windows and natural lights and light and green roofs and all the other potential sustainable applications to building design. I want to sort of mention those as encouraging those opportunities as part of the design guidelines. Next. And we want to make sure that the open space is high quality and interactive. I mean, the zoning provides just the basic standard that 15% of the lot has to be in open space, and what the design guidelines would help you shape those spaces. And so we're looking for, vibrant spaces, whether they're pocket parks or pathways or outdoor terraces, plazas, or even rooftop terraces. We want to make sure that there's a lot of opportunities to interact for business people that are doing business there or working there, an opportunity to enjoy the experience while they're there. Next slide. So we would set up standards for for different types of outdoor amenity spaces, design guidelines, I should say, for these types of standards. We'd also integrate sustainable design for these spaces in terms of infiltration parks and plazas and those sorts of things. So we want them to be part of the stormwater treatment system. Next slide. And then finally, public realm activation or improvements. So basically, this is the image on your right shows the potential cross section of Hartwell, and what we were looking at is sort of defining that area between not only within the right of way, but basically from the building face to the building face across Hartwell, and the different types of elements that would go into designing not only the street right of way, but the spaces in front of the building. So see things like the vehicle lanes, obviously that's going to be all part of the 25% design that's in the process. Crosswalks, curb extensions, bus facilities, green infrastructure, that's all within the right of way. But if you look beyond that, there may be standards for bicycle parking, public seating, driveway access and crossings, and other things that are sort of related and directly connecting to the right of way. We want to make sure is that you go from the street to the individual properties, that there's a smooth transition and that we maintain pedestrian accessibility and safety. Next slide. And then finally, ways to activate those spaces. So again, looking at the diagram on the lower left, that space between the building and the right of way, there's all types of things that could happen in there. And we want to, again, we're trying to encourage as much as possible utilization of that space for different purposes, anything from public art to seating to the displays, open space, parks and plazas, those sorts of things. So we would put together a series of activation ideas and standards or guidelines so that, again, we're adding to the vibrancy, not only of that particular property, but of the district as a whole. So that's it for this this overview of design standards or design guidelines. And as I said, at our next meeting on, I think, December 1st, we'll have a lot more detail to share with you in terms of a rough draft of where we're headed with this.
Thank you, Ted. That was really, really helpful for us to understand design guidelines. And I think now we would really want to have some feedback from the audience and to have a more robust feedback session and a Q&A session. Amanda has some slides that will help us. In the meanwhile, Casey, if you can promote everyone so that everyone can see each other on the screen, and you can use the chat feature if you have questions, and we will be happy to answer any question pertaining to today's session. So you can start typing your questions, or you can they raise their hand, Casey?
Yes, there is a raise hand function if you
Okay.
want to indicate that you'd like to speak rather than type your question.
Mm-hmm. We are promoting folks. Yeah.
Someone has their hand up. Do you want me to start taking the questions?
Yes, thank you, Stella.
So Avram, if you want to unmute yourself, you can ask your question.
Okay, my question is, I guess my first question, if I get called on again, does the endeavor fall apart if, for example, town meeting approves the zoning now, but in the future doesn't approve the funding for the infrastructure repairs that you described, not repairs, upgrades? And does the infrastructure upgrades have to be in place as a show of good faith by the town before people will begin developing their properties?
I think we're going to just kind of collaborate on the responses. I can, this is Carol Kowalski. I can begin to answer that. It's very likely that what we'll consider doing is have contributions. For example, if with a certain trigger of development, they would have to pay into a fund or to contribute to infrastructure upgrades. Some of you might be aware, for example, of the Transportation Management Overlay District in Hartwell, which is already in place, and we're updating that plan so that transportation improvements can be paid for by development as new development occurs. We can get contributions, incremental contributions towards that infrastructure, those infrastructure improvements.
There's another question in the chat from Lynn Jensen. How is the design guideline binding like the bylaw?
The binding, the guidelines aren't binding. They are in fact guidelines, but you know the applicants are strongly encouraged to fulfill them, and you know, and the development review team will work with them, and if there are alternatives to the design guidelines that make sense, then they would basically, the review team would basically propose that as an alternative to design guidelines to the planning board. As someone might come up with a great idea for a particular site with unique circumstances that is a little bit different than what the design guidelines are calling for, but they are still guidelines. They aren't standards. They're complementary to the zoning requirements, and they're really intended to sort of fill out some of the basic standards that are in the zoning, such as a 15% open space. So if they're designing a plaza, there'll be design guidelines for that, and we strongly encourage applicants to use those. And if they don't, they would probably want to provide the design development review team a good reason why not, and if they've got a better alternative. And then that would be part of the recommendations that went on to the planning board in terms of their consistency with the design guidelines and reasons why they're not in certain areas.
I think I'll add that you always want to leave some room for some creativity too. You don't want to be extremely prescriptive, because then you might miss out on some exciting idea that a designer can propose. I also wanted to add that an analogy to, let me put it this way. We already have a Historic Districts Commission in Lexington, as everyone knows. And what's binding is the legislation that established the HDC. The HDC has guidelines as well, and those aren't part of the law, the HDC statute, but they do tell a builder, if you want to know what the HDC is expecting to see, they're right here in our guidelines. So it might be a more predictable and an easier process if you follow the guidelines. It doesn't mean you can't come in with a proposal that deviates, but it might take longer and you might not be successful. Whereas you're more likely to be successful if you follow the guidelines, generally speaking.
There's a couple more questions that have come in the chat box. One from Niles Barnert. Are the traffic impacts of a development considered in the design guidelines for a project?
They are. Well, the traffic design will be, that's sort of a separate process that's ongoing, and that's related to what Carolyn described as part of the transportation management overlay district. So under that zoning provision, the developers have to work with the town to fulfill the improvements that are called for in the plan. And some of that would occur within the right of way, and then other recommendations would be made for areas adjacent to the right of way. So I think that the planning board and the development review team would be looking for certain streetscape improvements on the other side of the right of way and along their front yard that contribute to the overall multi-mobility and vibrancy of the streetscape.
From Mike Beverly, what happens if some property owners do not choose to develop their properties but leave them as is?
Nothing. It's fully up to any property owner to take advantage of the zoning and the design guidelines.
From Patty Dahlgren, a South Road Bedford resident, can you address why the town of Bedford is not listed as a stakeholder despite the impact of the traffic and construction on the abutting town, specifically Summer and South Road?
I can say that we do have a meeting scheduled with Bedford staff, and we do have Bedford officials on our stakeholder and contact list. And we have had a member, or perhaps a former member of the select board in Bedford at our October 15th morning coffee, which is a similar session to this. So we're trying to do our best to make sure we communicate with Bedford and reach out to Bedford.
Tina McBride is wondering, the diagrams were attractive. Are there 3 lanes of traffic on either side of the street or 2 lanes with 1 parking lane? And at what point in the process is the road widened?
That's the diagram that's in the PowerPoint is a conceptual plan from a couple of years ago. So it's really not determined yet what's exactly going to happen with the full out design, but I think that the principles are that it be multimodal, that there are accommodations for obviously vehicles, but also for bikes and pedestrians, and that there's an attractive streetscape. So that's all part of what's being worked out to as part of the 25% design process, is the elements of that street. It is a 100-foot right of way, so there is a lot of room within there to do some creative things, including a possible boulevard, which is shown in the diagram. But that's all, those are all details that have to be worked out in the design process.
From Diane Persley, you mentioned parking ratios. Are you thinking of setting them similar to LEED certified standards as Estabrook School has done?
That one for me or Amanda? I'm not familiar with the LEED, unless there's a LEED ND, neighborhood development standard for parking ratios, but there are ratios that are put together by the Institute of Traffic Engineers, as well as the Urban Land Institute, that have really changed over the last number of years. They've gone down in terms of the amount of parking spaces per commercial square footage and industrial square footage. So I don't know if that's something we're taking up as part of this particular process, but it's a good question.
Yeah, I think with transportation and parking, we are going to put that one in the December meeting.
December 14th.
December 14th.
From David, I can't see your whole last name. Will the relaxation of the front setback come with an expectation of increased setbacks in the rear of the properties, especially for those properties that adjoin environmentally sensitive areas?
Well, the one big thing is that a lot of the wetlands and the floodplains are in the rear of the properties or to the sides. So the more that you can pull things closer to the road, but also keep that vegetated buffer that everyone has identified with Hartwell, the better. So it'd be really kind of making sure that the development is closer to the street and the environmentally sensitive areas are protected and maybe used kind of as passive recreation rather than more active recreation where those are more intense.
Yeah, I would agree with that. You mentioned that, especially in the south side, you're facing a lot of wetlands behind the buildings, so there really isn't much opportunity there for development. And we want to shrink the parking footprint, and that's primarily in the back of the building. So, well, there's not a direct relationship between new investment and new development in the front and the rear. Our idea is to create better buffers in the back where you're facing wetlands, where you're facing neighborhoods in some situations, and even where you're up against the navigation easement at the runway. So we're just taking advantage of the best opportunities that are in Hartwell, which is really in front of the buildings that are there today, or on the existing building footprint as they are today.
Another one from Diane. In regards to the aerial picture that was shown at the beginning of the presentation with playing fields, is this still being considered? And could we consider getting a sponsorship for such fields like the MathWorks fields, which are in Natick?
I'm just going to say it's kind of hard to answer that one, in my opinion, because that's, I'm looking to review it in the chat. I can't find it. You're talking about the playing field that was depicted in the illustration in the Hartwell vision. That, in my opinion, I'm pretty sure that happens to be in an area where you couldn't put a playing field, but it would be great if we could get a playing field, maybe scaled down a little bit somewhere in Hartwell. But we are far from that level of detail of planning specific site amenities and open space. But it's been in that picture consistently, and it's not out of the question that we could try to accommodate it somewhere if there's enough room. I don't know if Amanda or Ted want to elaborate on that or add to it.
Yeah, that's currently a substation. It's part of that utility easement. I love the concept plan, but it's really just a concept plan. But really, what it's really intended to do, though, is provide an illustrative example of the fact that what we're trying to get in the district is more open space, both passive and active open spaces. So well, it may not go on that particular site, we'd like to see something like that in the park where it would benefit the people that are working there, but also people and the surrounding neighborhoods.
From Ruth Ladd, there's a trail shown on the plan, much of which looks like it's through wetlands. That could be problematic. Has this issue been considered in regards to potential trails?
We are all so well aware of all of the resource area in the Hartwell area district. Karen Mullins is Lexington's conservation director, and she was with us last week for a session similar to this that focused on floodplain resource area and especially stormwater. She's our colleague in the Land Use Health and Development Department, and we are, there will be nothing planned through wetland that isn't permitted through the Conservation Commission. That's very, there's no way around that. We wouldn't want to get around that.
There are a couple questions there's a lot of questions coming in, but there's a few that are related to transportation. So I'm gonna skip those for now and we could revisit them or take note for the transportation session. So just give me
that sounds great. And Stella, I think I'm gonna have, Amanda has some of the questions prepared so that we get feedback related to design guidelines so that we can process that feedback and have more questions towards design guidelines so that we can prepare a draft design guidelines. Amanda, Casey, can you share your screen? Thank you. And Amanda, do you want to go through? Okay, thank you.
So the first question that we have tonight is, if Hartwell and Bedford Street
If Hartwell and Bedford Street were a clean slate, vacant, what types of features would be desirable for the following?
So basically what we want to see is if you can be creative and you were a developer or an architect or a landscape architect or a planner, how would you design Hartwell? And what are those features that you would want to see there? What type of streetscape, furniture, lighting, etc.? Pedestrian amenities or bicycle amenities, parking. How would you design the service and utility areas? Signage and graphics. Signage is a big thing, but that also includes wayfinding, landscaping, but also site access and site circulation. Would you rather see everyone have individual curb cuts, alleyways, shared parking? So it's an open canvas. We kind of just want to know, how would you design Hartwell if you were designing it for an innovation park, but that's also very vibrant and attractive, that would make you want to go there and also work there, because that's a big thing. You want to like where you work.
Any comments or any feedback on that? That would be really helpful for us to take away from this meeting. Stella, thank you.
Yeah, there's, while people are thinking about that, I'll address one of the questions that was above. How do the dimensional controls in Article 16 match the dimensional controls that would be used if there was no Article 16 coming up?
I think this is a combination of a couple different things.
Yeah.
And so what the design standards under article or dimensional standards under Article 16 versus what is being proposed with this article is they're very similar. What this proposal intends to do is fill out what the structure is created. So Article 16 creates the structure. It establishes the boundaries of the district. It establishes the dimensionals. And it also establishes the framework within the zoning bylaw. With that said, this part actually comes in and fills that out. It specifically is going to tell developers how we want to be permitted, what we want, and how this project should look. It's also going to take those dimensional standards and shape them and provide guidance to that developer. So we've been working, and I believe that prior to me getting here, that Mr. Rovitz and the citizen petition had worked together to make sure that those were all kind of very dovetailed together. So I don't know if Ms. Kowalski or Ted or Mr. Rovitz have any comments on that as well.
I do not have anything to add to it.
Well, I would just say that this started out as a much more comprehensive zoning package, what we call form-based code, which is an integration of the typical zoning requirements and then adding to it sort of design standards. And we decided that we wanted to separate that out. So there was a lot of thought that went into the draft zoning that is being carried forward. It's just that it's separated from some of the particular details of the design guidelines. So there is some consistency there in terms of the dimensional standards that are proposed in the article and the design standards that are sort of taking that extra space and using it for economic as well as other attribute kind of uses.
Thank you. In regards to this question posed that we see on the screen, Leonard Morse Fortier has responded, let's not move whatever new buildings may be built closer to the existing streets and instead move to create two one-way streets that would abut sidewalks that pass directly in front of existing buildings, which could result in an intermediate space approximately 200 feet wide. This could remain a green space median or could be developed into blocks for housing or ancillary commercial uses. Lynn Jensen asks, can you tell us more about about the sustainability part of the design guidelines? Will it include passive housing, electrical HVAC heat pump, and solar panels on rooftops, etc.?
So just to jump in real quick, what is being proposed does not include a housing component. That is being researched and will not be brought forward until the annual town meeting of 2022. Regarding sustainable design, that is really going to be kind of built out at that December 7th meeting. We're really going to be focusing 2 hours on sustainability and different types of features. So that'll only be part of the design standards, but also part of the bylaw as well. So we're not trying to, dismiss sustainability, but we're going to be taking those key features and actually having on December 7th, a very robust conversation. We have a couple experts coming in to talk about different projects that they've worked on to make sure that they're sustainable and meeting zero emissions.
I would just add to clarify that there will be aspects of sustainability which would be included in a design guideline and some that would be included in the bylaw, and those topics, regardless of where they'll end up, will be discussed at that session.
That's right.
Sorry, I'm reading a lot on the side. One moment, trying to find the questions.
I see Richard Canale's hand is raised. Maybe we can go to him in the interim.
Do you want to unmute yourself?
Hi. I just wanted to make a couple of comments, and I'm very pleased about the presentation. I think it was quite excellent. This is pretty much where we were a year ago when Mr. Brovitz presented to the joint board, and then things sort of reached a halt. So I'm glad that we didn't lose that. Looks like the only thing we've lost here is the housing component, which is unfortunate. But what I wanted to do was to say what is so good about what you presented tonight is it looks like an integrated plan. You know, in part of what I was hoping, and it looks like you're on your way, is for this to be a plan development rather than a, you know, each developer gets to say what they want to do. And Amanda had talked to the planning board and had talked about, you know, what is it that we can do to incentivize developers to want to build these things? Because if Article 16 were passed, and one of the things Carol said at the beginning of the meeting is we want the guidelines to match the zoning. We don't want to be in a situation where we are going to ask for things that aren't in the zoning. And if the zoning says that folks can do things by right, period, without these things in the zoning, then it's difficult to say, well, gee, we want you to go through this process, because, you know, in a site plan review, we can't say no if it meets the zoning, if it meets the requirements, if it meets the height, if it meets the setbacks, which is kind of unfortunate because I guess I would want to know what, in terms of what's coming, is what are the incentives that are going to be built into the new zoning that will encourage developers to want to do this or require them. I mean, we talked about the differences between site plan review, which you can't turn down if it meets the zoning, versus special permit, which Mr. Brovitz kind of indicated we might do through the process, that if we don't like it, we can give them a hard time. I don't think that's the purpose of site plan review. We want them to do it because, you know, it's the right thing to do. So I guess I would like to know what your thoughts are with respect to how do we incentivize developers from not coming in and say, I can build a box and it doesn't have to look pretty. It's going to cost me extra money. It's going to cost this. This is what I want to do. It meets the by right zoning. I just want my permit. You know, so are there things, and again, whether somebody builds a 11-story office tower or a nice 5-story lab building, it's up to the developer to think what's going to make them the most profit rather than how it fits into the vision that's here. So if you could address a couple of those things, I think that would be helpful for folks. It would be helpful for me.
I can comment, and Amanda, I'm sure, has some comments. Just generally speaking, with incentives, one of the things that's kind of like with an incentive is you don't get to play if you don't do it the way we want it. That's a real, my favorite term is the Dr. Seuss approach to a concept. That's how an incentive works, and that's what we have the opportunity to implement here. Is if you want to access this opportunity, you have to meet the guidelines. You have to contribute to infrastructure. Those are some examples of ways we can create the incentive in a way, not just incentive, but it's, if you want access to this zoning, that's what you get. That's what you have to do, excuse me.
So the zoning we're going to see in 2 weeks will have that, because it's not in Article 16.
So the draft zoning that is going to be coming out at the beginning of December is going to be having various incentives as to what you need to do to be able to achieve a maximum project. So there's going to be a lot of different things included, which is why it's very essential that we get a lot of feedback to make sure that we're understanding what people are concerned about, what are things that are happening. We work in the town, but there's things that happen at other times of the day where we can't see it all the time. But someone that may work in Hartwell or may live outside of Hartwell, they see things on a regular basis that are items that we need to know so that we can make sure that those items are either addressed or mitigated within the zoning, because that is one thing that the design guidelines and the zoning bylaw can actually achieve, is to mitigate adverse effects, but also to make sure that items get addressed or are improved. I think that previously Carol was talking about the design guidelines and the zoning bylaw. And the nice part about having the both of them is that the zoning bylaw makes sure that here's what you have to do to meet our minimum standards. And here's the guidelines that makes it fill it out. So what you see in the pedestrian, how you experience the site. So we're going to make sure that both of those address, but also, as Carol said, provides that flexibility, because if someone comes in with a great technology or innovation that's cutting edge, it should be considered, and that the planning board or the building commissioner should be able to take a review on those items. So we are making sure these are all addressed, and that will be what is released. The good news is also what's released in December is going to be continue to be worked on throughout December through January, and then in February, when we bring it forward to the planning board for the public hearing to bring it forward to annual town meeting, hopefully at that point we'll have everything firmed down. But just because what's released on December 1st is a draft, it's not exactly what's going to be brought forward in February.
Just to add to that, that design guidelines, and Amanda, Carol, please correct me if I'm wrong, but the town meeting does not vote on design guidelines. So it's a zoning bylaw, which is much more binded, and which has many more regulations for the zoning article, whereas the design guidelines is much more of a grasp of what should or what makes it more specific to Hartwell Innovation Park. Great. Casey, can you get to the next? Yeah.
I was going to say the same thing to the next question. And so we can put these questions up on the website. And if you want to provide us like an email providing us information on these, that would be great, because all the information we can get is only going to help us strengthen and provide a better product. So the second question, in your travels, have you seen any great examples of tech parks, industrial parks, revitalized office parks that Lexington could use as examples? So this is a common theme throughout the country and also in Europe and other places as well, that these old tired technology or office parks are being reutilized or revitalized to actually allow for collaboration, allow for community, but to create a place. The Newton Needham, or N Squared, is an example where the TripAdvisor's headquarters is. The Google campus is another one, but a lot of people travel for work or just do traveling, probably pre-COVID. And if anyone has any great examples they could provide us, that would be awesome as well, so we can make sure to see what they did and give us additional information.
Meanwhile, while they're thinking about that, there's a few things that have come up in the chat while you are all talking, some of which we can just take note of. They're more so some feedback, but a few questions. Could somebody, I'm just creating a question based on what I'm could you clarify what the difference between a guideline or a requirement is, because there seems to be some confusion of that language, as well as incentives and how that differs from what is required.
Well, design guidelines are basically recommendations that are made that complement the requirements that are in the zoning bylaw. So as we use open space as an example, there's a 15% open space requirement, but there's typically in the zoning doesn't go beyond that in terms of laying out what those open spaces could be. So that's where the design guidelines would pick up and say that, you know, you can do a series of different open spaces. In this case, we're really looking for active open spaces. And with those, there would be design guidelines, you know, some particular dimensional characteristics that would go with different types of open spaces. And they would be worked, you know, into the development and with the assistance of the development review team in reviewing the preliminary application. So again, there's still guidelines, and they still have to work out, you know, the final application and the site plan particulars. But you know, they would be, you know, the applicant would be obligated to, you know, consider the design guidelines and hopefully work those in. And again, if the development review team doesn't feel that they have adequately addressed the guidelines, they would be making a recommendation to the planning board that there needs to be more done in certain aspects of the development proposal, in this case, open space.
Thank you. And there's another question. Do you mean tiered zoning? For example, if you meet the design guidelines, you'll be able to have bigger dimensions.
No, the dimensions are laid out in the zoning regulations. So if the height and the setbacks and the floor area ratio creates that box of opportunity, of development opportunity, then the design guidelines would shape that box and shape the site in terms of you know, design characteristics of the building, layout of the site, you know, quality of open spaces, and those things. So the zoning creates the box, and then the design guideline shapes the box. Is the best way I could put it.
Pictures in the slideshow show large setbacks with lots of greenery. And I think that in the proposals in Article 16, it eliminates the potential for large open green communal spaces. Could you offer clarification on that?
The pictures that show large open spaces?
I think what they're wanting to know is some of the things people are saying that they are envisioning, and some of the pictures demonstrated sort of large green open space. They're in the setback area, but if the dimension, or in Article 16, if the setback is, will the setback limits in that restrain the opportunity to create that type of green space?
Oh, not at all. It's just providing the opportunity to, you know, build in front of the current buildings, but also that doesn't mean that has to happen. It still could be another green space. It could be you know, it could be a park or a common. What we're really looking for in the design guidelines, and hopefully in the zoning too, is creating a better relationship with the street and the streetscape and the sidewalks. So that could be buildings with nice plazas and outdoor seating. Or it could be an open space for gathering, you know, where you could have food trucks come in, or you could have picnics or what have you. So it's not prohibiting that, but it's basically the overall objective is to provide economic opportunity, but also create better relationships and sort of an extension of the sidewalk and the streetscapes.
Another way to say it is that currently you wouldn't really find, I don't think you'd find yourself welcome on the green lawns that are in front of the buildings in Hartwell today. In the future, we hope that you will find green lawns where humans are welcome and want to hang out, they'll be appealing, one hopes. Not that these green lawns aren't beautiful green lawns, but right now they're kind of almost like a no man's land in a way. And we want it to be a place that's looks like we're welcoming, we're expecting you. Come, be here. So that's the difference between something that's planned and designed and deliberate and something that's almost an afterthought. I think what we see today out there is an afterthought of green lawn.
I think that sort of reflects the sort of the 1980s, suburban model of having deep front yards, and they're just sort of, formal and ornamental, and really don't have a particular, application or use. And we're trying to encourage more activity in those spaces, whether it's through development or through better open spaces, or a combination of both.
We have some feedback in regards to, I think, the first question you posed, Amanda, from Deborah Strad. She would like to see green space, natural lighting, clean lines and glass and color within the buildings, natural paths, not dangerous to cross the streets, places to sit and play, maybe places to have a game or a concert. Parking behind in more condensed area is ideal, safe and well lit at night, visible sustainability as in solar panels, recycling, water capture, maybe banners on the streets that can be changed out so it reflects similarly to the center of town, and community interest.
Thank you.
That's a great
Good
list.
suggestions.
There's
All right. Well, this is actually a good question based off of what that last comment was. What are key features that will make Hartwell and downtown different? So Hartwell is not supposed to recreate downtown. They're supposed to be uniquely different, but they have to complement each other because they're going to be both coexist, but one should not take away from the other. So what are things that we can make sure that are provided in Hartwell that keep them different so they aren't competing, but rather complementing?
This is Lin Jensen. Can I say something?
Yep.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So I think that's a great question. I love it. So I was wondering, just thinking about if there should be a kind of a general theme you would suggest to builders. So like, the bricks are very prominent in downtown. Would you suggest the usage of bricks? I'm not a designer. I'm just giving examples. Or even the signage, or the pedestrian path, or even should there be any like consistency between different lots? So it's not like one lot is so different from the next lot. And also I really like the idea of shared parking. So you can build multiple levels of parking behind, so then maybe that will use less space. I mean, shared by multiple buildings if you have a shared parking for multiple buildings. I don't know if it's okay for safety reasons, but just a thought.
Well, that's certainly one of the things that would be in the design guidelines is, the opportunities for shared parking, cross access, encouraging, less curb cuts and shared access, because curb cuts create conflicts with pedestrians. But there'd also be consistency in terms of pathways and other pedestrian amenities from lot to lot. if we're trying to build a trail somewhere through this park, you want to make sure that if it crosses individual lots, there's consistency in its width and the material and other characteristics. So there would be consistency in that, as well as other things such as curb extensions at the intersections and other things that are meant to make it easier and safer for pedestrians to get around. So that would all be addressed in the design guidelines. And I'm sure that some of it would also be addressed in the zoning as well.
Thank you. There's, to answer this question 3, downtown would reflect history, while Hartwell would reflect modern and the future.
I think that's a fair statement, but I don't live in Lexington, so that's really kind of up to you all. But I think that the combination of zoning and design guidelines provide that opportunity to make a real distinction between our very historic center and really what is sort of a blossoming tech park, and sort of growing from its 1980s roots to a really sort of a modern and contemporary opportunity for new development.
From Richard Cannell, wouldn't we get better design if there was lot consolidation rather than lot subdivision by right? Are 11-story, 115-foot buildings part of this vision?
So 11 stories was not part of this vision. The one thing that right now I believe it's like 65 feet is what's under Article 16. Offices require shorter ceiling, floor to ceiling heights compared to lab space. Lab space needs a lot more because they have mechanical equipment, they have hoods, they have other things that have to go in between the floors. But 11 stories and 115 feet would not be really, I don't believe, realistic in this area, but I don't know if Ted has anything to comment on this one as well.
I think you're right. I think that, tech space or lab space requires somewhere about 12 to 14-foot stories. So the chances of it becoming 11 stories is unlikely. So it's really not meant for, that situation. It's really meant to accommodate, tech buildings, life science buildings.
Can we go to next slide, please?
So number 4, when you think of Hartwell today, what are features that would make it more vibrant?
I do want to say that you can unmute yourself if you want to comment on any of these questions. Please feel free to comment or use the chat box.
Well, I would think the bike path was really nice, and if it can be connected with the pedestrians, so people have more walkability, I think that's great. I saw a lot of people walking during lunch breaks and who work there, and also just the neighbors. I think it's really brings the community together.
In the chat box, we have vibrancy requires people, housing and mini retail, restaurants, shops, outdoor spaces. Right now, it's just a place for work.
Can I speak? I don't know if people can hear me.
We can hear you.
Okay. So I may be confused because I had to join late, and I really apologize for that. But you've put 4 questions up here now. I've actually tried to answer each of them. Is it reasonable to expect that those responses are simply intended to be, thought of later, or are these things open to discussion now? Because I have many ideas for how to make Hartwell a wonderful place, and I've tried to type out several of them, and maybe they're just going to be considered for future consumption, and that's fine. But I wasn't clear what we were trying to accomplish in this meeting.
So what we're trying to accomplish is to gather responses to these questions. So if you provided them in the chat, we will have that because we get all the chat information compiled. But also, if you want to unmute yourself like you are right now, you're more than welcome to answer some of these questions. But this is really kind of meant to be a two-way conversation to collect this information. So when we are working on the design guidelines and the zoning bylaw, that these things are incorporated in and addressed.
Okay, thank you. I have to say, most of the vibrancy that I've seen along Hartwell lately are the wild turkeys. For those of you who spend any time running around out there, my daughter and I take our tandem bike out every day we can, and we see them every day. And I'm not sure I think they're wonderful, but they are vibrant and out there. I just think the whole vision for Hartwell it seems myopic in some respects. And the current Article 16 just makes people's property worth a lot more money without having the restrictions in place. Forget incentives, forget, all I think there have to be real hard-edged restrictions. For those of you who know Elizabeth Plater-Zyberk or Anja Stoini, they've done a lot of design work around a movement that they refer to as, or some others refer to as, new urbanism. And they've created some really wonderful places. Then others who have tried and not done so well, for example, if you've been to the Celebration, Florida, where the Walt Disney Corporation did what I think is a poor job of incorporating their ideas, the differences are palpable. And they're, right now, south of the University of Notre Dame, for those of you who can't get to South Bend, you can Google Earth your way there. They, when I was teaching there, and it's 30 years ago now, they didn't really have a college town. And South Bend did not feel like a college town. Among other things, you may not realize just how small the University of Notre Dame used to be. It was only about 5,000 students. Now it's probably twice that. But they've built a new town just south of there on vacant land. And so they've shown what you can do when you go from vacant land to what I would call new urban density. And there are townhouses and there are shops, and it has become phenomenally vibrant in really just a very short period of time. As I say, I left there 30 years ago. That's not a long time. And most of what we're seeing has happened within the last 10 years. So it's a great model. I encourage those of you who ask for models to look at that. I do think if you want vibrancy, you have to have housing. If everyone leaves at 5 or 6 o'clock, there won't be any vibrancy left. You can expect or hope that somebody might drive to some place after all the people who work there are gone. But if people don't live there, there's usually not a lot going on. So those are my points, and I will leave the written stuff for you to consume as you wish.
Thank you.
I just add that I agree that people make a place vibrant. So I don't know if we're gonna add more bus stops. I think that would help. And also chairs, outdoor chairs or shelter, either tree canopies or just some kind of shelter with a cover in case it drizzles. I think that would help when people want to walk that long stretch of street. They want to just take a break somewhere. Thank you.
The question in the chat, why are buildings of this height being proposed for the Hartwell Bedford area, not for the town center? And the Hartwell Innovation Park appears to be spot zoning. Why not develop these guidelines for the whole town? And if not, why?
There's a lot of questions there. The first one about why aren't taller buildings being proposed in the center? I can try to address. The historic district, I think it would be challenging, although historically there were taller buildings in the center. You can look in the Worthen photo archive and see some photos of, I think there's even one that was 6 stories. But I think that it would be more difficult to do that right now with the Historic Districts Commission and with the current zoning. It doesn't mean that that might not occur, but right now our commercial district, our big lab, the place where you can have lab buildings and where you can have biotech and pharmaceutical research is Hartwell. So we want to try to make the most of it where we already have some of it. You really kind of wouldn't necessarily be able to do a lab building in the center. And it creates an opportunity for us to have 2 contrasting but really nice and really highly contributing commercial areas. One, the center with a very different role than what Hartwell is. So I'll stop talking so that we can get to your other questions, which I have to say I'm looking in the chat because I've forgotten. Can you, Stella, could you repeat the rest of the question, please?
Yeah, so the HIP area appears to be spot zoning. Why not develop these guidelines for the whole town? And if not developing them for the whole town, why is that?
Spot zoning is usually when someone has a parcel in a district and just the one parcel is rezoned. This is a district with many parcels, so it would be hard to make a claim. Technically, it'd be hard to make a claim of spot zoning. If Amanda, if you want to elaborate on that, feel free.
Yeah, so as long as one individual property owner is not the sole beneficiary, that is not considered spot zoning. And since there's 51 parcels, and of those 51 parcels, there's probably 30 plus different landowners, that is actually considered a district rather than one spot. If we were only rezoning one parcel of land, for example, like a project that the planning board just saw, 91 Hartwell, and we were only changing that, we were only allowing them to do maximum height and all these districts, that would be considered spot zoning because only one person benefited. But since there's more than one, this is not, it's a district. The other question that was not asked here, but often comes up is why were we not looking at this as an overlay district? And an overlay district and an actual zoning district are 2 very different things. The overlay is usually used for special cases and the underlying zoning still remains. So what we're doing is we're redoing the CM or the CRO district to make it uniform into the HIP zoning district.
I think the other question, Amanda, was why aren't there design guidelines for other parts of towns? And that could happen in the future. I mean, obviously, what's proposed in and what's allowed actually in HIP is much different than the characteristics and mix of uses that you see in the town center. As are, there's big distinctions between the town center and the rural residential areas. So a lot of towns have design guidelines that address the particular areas of town in different ways based on the current characteristics or what they hope to see in the future in terms of the scale and design of development. So we're just tackling Hartwell at this point in terms of design guidelines.
Question number 5. If you were employed in Hartwell, what design features would you want to utilize? And what are design features that you would make it more vibrant and inviting? So if you were someone that worked there or was just passing through there, what would make you stop? Or also what were things that you would use on your lunch break or after or before work that is not there today?
There was an earlier comment which relates to this question as well. They suggest community use on the weekends, being able to take their kids there, and when the businesses are not operating, having spaces like open air theaters for concerts and gatherings, so that it's not just something used in the daytime, but also in the evenings and on the weekends for community events and gathering small groups.
That's a good response.
Can you go to the next slide, please?
Question number 6, knowing the constraints associated with Hartwell, are there any recommendations to provide a vibrant workplace while providing active and passive outdoor community space? So are there things that Lexington doesn't have that should be in this area? So someone mentioned MathWorks previously, and MathWorks was actually looking for cricket fields. And so they had a hard time finding those, but they found them eventually. But are there things like that? And the difference between active, and like just to quickly summarize, is active is like playing fields and sports and racing and stuff like that. Passive is more sitting or enjoying, kind of relaxing, but still being outdoors.
I'm wondering if I could share my screen to show everyone 2 images, if that's a possibility.
Leonard, if you can put that in the chat box, that would be great. We can all access through the chat box, but unfortunately the share screen feature is just for. Thank you.
Someone in the chat is saying that in regards to question 5, based on the feedback, it sounds like this type of area would draw people away from the center. Could you address that?
And so that's what we're trying to avoid. But in doing that, we need to make sure that Hartwell is more of a place of employment today. And that's what it will remain. The focus of is a place of employment, but it's adding amenities to that to make it more attractive. Downtown right now is more of a destination, but also has other features, but not as many large scale businesses as there are smaller businesses. And I don't know if Sadia or Casey or Carol.
I'd like to comment too that if things go as hoped, we'll have people at Hartwell for certain reasons drawn to Hartwell, most likely because they'll work there. We'll have people in the center, perhaps for different reasons. Of course, we have employees, but they're not necessarily lab employees. While we have people in both locations, we want them to be engaged in their environment. We want them to be delighted by their environment. So it's not as though we would want to have we wouldn't want to have Hartwell being less pleasant just in order to contrast it with the center. There are 2 different purposes for those districts. And I sense that Lexington would like to keep that. There's a reason for each to continue to exist. We can, with that contrast though, we can still make people feel delighted and interested and engaged and happy and welcome to be in either place. And that's what we're hoping to do by creating vibrancy in Hartwell. It shouldn't be taking away from the center.
There's a question regarding question 6. The ENC Barnett are finding that the design guidelines questions are premature. For instance, how do we know that we don't know the constraints associated with Hartwell? Specifically, how could the town provide community spaces without putting forth money?
So in terms of community spaces, just for clarification, it doesn't have to be actually town owned. It can be on private property. As Ted showed, pocket parks are a great use of land. Each parcel has to have open space, and that can actually become community space where two landowners share that open space, but also it has pathways and trails through it. So it allows people who are passing through to utilize it. The N Squared or Newton Needham Tech Park, they have a requirement where if two landowners actually put their open space requirements directly abutting each other, they can reduce their open space because in fact they're creating a larger open space area. But it's also with the understanding that they can actually both use it, and then also people within the district use it as well. So it's actually not the town of Lexington creating this community space, but rather having the private developers creating almost like a master planned community similar to what they have in Burlington, but having individual landowners because all these parcels are individually owned, unlike Burlington where they were owned by one owner.
Yeah, the design guidelines are really intended for open spaces on private land, and that could be publicly accessible, and it could take a variety of different uses in terms of active or passive open spaces. I mean, the investment that the town is making in cooperation with the property owners is really the streetscapes and the right of way and the new Hartwell design. But it's also possible that the town could work with private owners in forming a trail system. There's a lot of land that the town owns in and around the park, conservation lands and otherwise, that they could work cooperatively with property owners to create a trail system so that it benefits not only people that work in the park, but people that live in the surrounding area and beyond.
Just to add on to that, to kind of elaborate on when a developer is actually, like right now, there's not as much conversation that could be happening with the property owners. But the nice part of this project is that bringing the actual landowners and the developers to the table, it allows a two-way conversation between the town to actually achieve exactly what Ted is saying with the design guidelines, to get these community spaces, to get this added streetscape, to get this more of a community neighborhood kind of setting. So if you don't make any change, there's no reason to make amendments. But if you bring people to the table, there's a large conversation, and that's kind of where you can get that incentive, which has been talked about a lot, is if we do this, they can do that, but you have to get to the table to do that.
The hazelnut things, they're up.
Do you want to go to question 7? All right. Are there any recommendations on making Hartwell a destination on the Minuteman bike path or identifying an arrival for Hartwell? So is it really, since the Minuteman bike path is a great amenity of Lexington, it cuts through this entire district, it is actually a major connector between the downtown and Hartwell. Are there things that people can think of to actually make the node where the intersects Hartwell and the bike path a place to make people stop?
There's a comment in the chat. I think that those of us who are not professionals have a hard time envisioning how this cooperation among property owners occurs as the build out happens bit by bit. Can you help us see that? Is it that each building needs to use the last bit of the trail built by its neighbor?
So
Very often when, go ahead,
you can
Amanda.
go, Carol. Nope, you can go.
Well, very often when there's a zoning opportunity, it creates that opportunity is very motivating to property owners to negotiate together and to work together to try to recognize that they've got more that can be done if they work together, if they join their parcels. Or you might have one property owner who makes an offer to an adjacent property owner to acquire that land to assemble lots. So that's one of the ways. Those are a couple ways where just the zoning itself can create an incentive to assemble parcels.
I think also that, there's a lot of trail systems, spur systems where there's, a cooperative effort between adjacent property owners. And a lot of times that's sort of organized by towns. So this would be one of those situations if there's a combination of public lands as well as private lands that would be utilized for a trail system. You want to map it out, obviously, in specifics. And then you'd want to make sure you speak with the property owner to see if you can't get them to participate in forming a trail system. Obviously, if it's an amenity and it would benefit their employees as well as other employees throughout the park, as well as the people that live in the surrounding area. So it would take some work, there's no doubt about it, but it's not unusual for a town to sort of lead the effort to establish a trail system in a given part of town, and this would be one of those situations.
Leonard, this is your image. I don't know if you can speak to it.
Yes, there were two images I sent over. This is one of the development I was mentioning in South Bend. So these are townhouses, and it's printed to a PDF at the maximum scale that Bing Maps will allow me to blow it up. So the little blue bars in the lower right-hand corner, the left one says 50 feet. So that gives you a sense of scale. I firmly believe that a one-way street on either side of what's now Hartwell Avenue, where the street would be right up against the sidewalk, right up against the buildings, would create an interstitial space big enough to accommodate a wide range of development, including potentially this housing. And so by comparison, the other image I sent you shows Hartwell Avenue at the same scale. So you can take your mind's eye and imagine cutting and pasting those townhouses into the space that's otherwise the middle of Hartwell Avenue. And I'm sorry I don't have time to actually rotate the images and cut and paste them myself, but that would be something I would try to do if it would help you. I'm just trying to make the point that there's just a tremendous opportunity with as much land as there is there, and to leave that opportunity off of the table because we somehow imagine that the street has to stay where it is and the things have to stay the way they are is troubling to me. As soon as someone builds one building closer to where Hartwell Avenue is now, they would eliminate the option of doing what I've just tried to suggest by showing you these two images. I'm not sure where the second image went, but if you can show that, maybe we can all see it. Thanks.
I have a question alongside what Leonard just said. Is that even allowable or legal if to build something in the middle? Is that a part of, Leonard, are you suggesting to rezone the middle of the streets or where they're not developed, or is that what you're thinking?
Well, let's back up to the first part of your question. Is it legal? There's a topographic map that you can pull up from the USGS historical maps that shows what our part of Lexington looked like in 1946. Route 128 was not here. There were houses along both sides of Bedford Street all the way across the swamp that is now Route 128 and a lot of Hartwell Avenue. So the notion that you can or cannot do something legally is just a question of political will. I believe you could redeed the property in such a way as to create two separate one-way streets, each in front of the sets of buildings, and the interstitial space in between could then be sold to pay the landowners for what you took from them. You would certainly be taking something from them. You would also be enhancing their values. So it's negotiable. It's not a slam dunk, but it's not beyond the realm of possibility. It just requires thinking a little bit outside the box. And that's the only point I'm trying to make. I could address myself to why I think Lexington Center is a failure compared to Concord Center, but we don't need to go there. It's interesting to me that it would be very easy, if you did it right, for Hartwell Avenue to create a community that would so far and away be more attractive to people than Lexington Center that it could literally damage Lexington Center. But the people who seem to have control over Lexington Center seem more than capable of destroying it on their own. They don't need anybody else's help.
I think we should be mindful of the time. It's 9, and it was a very hearty conversation. We received a lot of feedback, and I do know that we still have more feedback coming in the chat box. We will be monitoring everything that has been posted in the chat, and I do want to be mindful that it's 9, and we will be having more sessions coming up on design guidelines and zoning bylaw on December 1st. So yes, Casey, if you can pull up, thank you. So the next session, as you can see, is on December 1st at 7 p.m. And we'll be discussing zoning bylaw, and we'll be having a recap of design guidelines, what we discussed, and what are our takeaways from this session. So this session, as you know, is being recorded, and the recording, as Casey mentioned, it will be available on the town's website as well as the new website that we have developed, which is hiplexington.com. Please, you can go there and you can review most of the presentation materials from previous presentations as well as today's presentation with the recording. So that's the social media, and there's a phone number 781-918-3350, and you can also tweet or hashtag. You can also use hashtag #HipLexington if you, or Lexington Hartwell if you would like to tweet anything regarding this. Having said that, I know these presentations had a lot of questions. Maybe you were not able to get to ask a question, or this might actually jog something later on. You might actually want to comment on something that you saw today later on. Please share your ideas, your comments with us on our website, hiplexington.com. There will be a space there for you to share your comments. And Sheila, do you want to add? And Bob will, Mr. Creech will be calling upon you soon. Sheila, do you have something to add? Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Jeez. Thank you, Sonia. No, I just, in closing, we reviewed the differences between the zoning and the design guidelines. We focused, with our focus being on the design guidelines, and some of the highlights of tonight were looking at how to activate the spaces and how we might encourage the developers to activate these spaces. Wetland protection continues to be a concern, of course, but we've heard that before, and we continue to hear that, which is good. We also talked about how we can incorporate site improvements into the design. So how we can incorporate stormwater mitigation as being part of the placemaking. The high interest in enhancing green spaces and the importance of shared parking, as that gives us flexibility. So you all have offered a lot of ideas, opinions, questions, and we didn't get to all of them, like Sandhya said, so we will go through the chat and we'll update some of the frequently asked questions on the website. We'll try to incorporate some of this comments in there as well. And the discussion does continue on December 1st with the sustainable, is sustainable on December 1st? No, that's the 7th.
No.
We continue with design guidelines and some zoning. at 7 p.m. at this same Zoom link. So we hope you can join us. And I want to turn it over to Mr. Creech so that he can close out the planning board meeting.
Well, thank you very much. Although you couldn't be expected to have all the answers, you certainly have a lot more questions and comments from this evening. So at 9:05 p.m. on November the 10th, 2020, I adjourn this meeting of the Lexington Planning Board.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all. Hope to see you all again. Good night.
Good night. We'll be sharing all the information and links in the future meetings. If you're interested in learning more about this initiative, please send us an email, and we'll keep you posted on any developments or any new material that we post. So please use the chat if you still want to leave an email or comment. Thank you. Hello, George.
I'm going to stop the recording now.
Thank you.